This is question 16 from section 1 of the 2016 TSA. In this question we ask which of the options is an underlying assumption of the argument. So let's look at the argument. First it says funding for education provision in UK prisons is a national disgrace. It says prisons provide free room and board and inmates are given access to the internet, cable TV and the gym. And then it says at the same time literacy classes have long waiting lists and budget cuts put pressure on library resources. So these are just facts about what prisons provide and at what levels. Then it says it's estimated at least half of UK prisoners possess a reading age of 11 or less. So again, it's just a factual claim. Next, if society wants to reduce the chances of prisoners reoffending, we have to give them the opportunity to develop the literacy skills they need to build a successful life outside prison. So I split this into two parts, because at the end there it's saying that literacy skills are needed to succeed outside prison, which is a factual claim. But here we also have this conditional claim that if we want to reduce the reoffending, we should help them gain those skills. Okay, so let's have a closer look at the structure of the argument so that we can see what assumptions are made in it. Okay, so we have these four factual claims. So those are going to be reasons for whatever conclusions the writer draws. And then we have these two claims that aren't factual, so they're being drawn as conclusions. One is, if we want to reduce reoffending, we should help prisoners gain literacy skills. And the other is that funding for prison education is a disgrace. So we'll try to figure out the flow of the argument. So which of these is the main conclusion and which of them is just an intermediate conclusion? Well, let's talk about which pieces of information support which others. So these two say prisoners need literacy skills to succeed outside prison, but a lot of prisoners don't have those skills. So those obviously support this conclusion that to reduce reoffending, which means making prisoners more successful outside prison, we should help prisoners gain literacy skills. And what relates to this? Well, these two pieces of information about what prisons provide don't really affect this conclusion. But they seem to be relevant to this, because if prisons are funding the wrong things, then that's what would make prison funding for education a disgrace. And if this conclusion is true that we should be helping prisoners gain literacy skills, that means we should be spending money on prison education. But this is saying we don't, instead we spend it on other things. So basically we're saying we need money spent on education, but it's being spent elsewhere. So those are both reasons for thinking that funding for prison education is a disgrace. So it looks like this is the main conclusion, and this is just an intermediate conclusion through which these pieces of information lead to this conclusion. So we've got all these different support arrows. An assumption could be, well, an assumption is something that's needed to make one of these implications work. So we'll look at the options and see if they undermine any part of this argument. Okay, so I just copied the argument structure I wrote above. Now let's look at the options A to E. So A says that prison is too easy for the inmates. Is that relevant to the argument? Or is it needed for any of these arrows to work? Well, this isn't something the writer seems to be saying. They mention things that prisoners get, but not in the way they suggest prisoners are getting it too easy. And they don't think funding is a disgrace because prisoners are getting it too easy, but instead because they're not getting enough money for education. So this doesn't seem to be relevant to any part of the argument. B says there's no educational value from watching TV or using the internet. Well, the argument is that money is needed for education, but it's being spent elsewhere. But suppose the TV or internet did have educational value, then spending that money on them, that's one of the things it's being spent on, then that would actually be helping prisoners gain literacy skills, and so funding wouldn't be so much of a disgrace because we would actually be supporting the prisoners in what they need. So it looks like in order for the argument to work, TV and internet have to be things that money shouldn't be spent on. And so they have to be things that have no educational value. And that means this is an assumption the writer's making. So it looks like this is going to be the answer, but let's just check the others. So C says education is a right, not a privilege. Well, it seems unlikely because the writer's not talking about rights at any point, so this just seems irrelevant. D says that prisoners have lower intelligence than the general population. Well, again, the writer isn't talking about how intelligent prisoners are. They don't seem to rely on this at any point, so that's not an assumption. And E says that prison should rehabilitate and not just punish. Well, this is something the writer seems to be using in this part. He says, if we want to reduce reoffending, we should help prisoners gain literacy skills to succeed outside prison. So that's what rehabilitation is. But that means the writer's explicitly relying on the assumption in this if statement. And that means this isn't an underlying assumption. So that's also not the answer. So we see that the answer is B.